The metallic doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the high-tech, yet sterile chamber beyond. Princess Talara stood at the threshold, her heart racing in anticipation. This was the moment, her first official meeting with a human. She had been briefed about them. Humans, a race of beings her people had always regarded with disdain. To them, humans were nothing more than primitive, unpredictable creatures. They were weak, too emotional, and barely worth the effort of engagement. And yet, here she was, walking into the lion's den, sent by her people to meet with them in a diplomatic summit that could either solidify the fragile peace between their empires or shatter it completely. Solara squared her shoulders, the royal robes of the Zerathian Empire flowing gracefully around her as she stepped further into the room. Her every movement was calculated, controlled. She had been trained for this moment since birth. Composure, strength, confidence. These were the pillars on which she had been raised. But today, as she stood in this room filled with humans, her calm demeanor faltered for the first time. She couldn't help but feel the unsettling gaze of Captain Adrian Hayes, standing at the far side of the room, waiting for her. Adrian was unlike any man she had ever seen. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the space with an air of quiet confidence. His uniform, an advanced combat suit, was fitted perfectly, designed for both function and defense. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled her. It was the calmness in his eyes. The way he looked at her, not with the reverence her title demanded, but with something far more disconcerting: indifference. He wasn't impressed by her status. She wasn't sure if that made him more dangerous or more intriguing. "Princess Solara," Adrian said, his voice deep and steady, his tone polite, but devoid of any fear or admiration. "I'm Captain Adrian Hayes. It's an honor to be assigned to your protection during this summit." Solara's lips tightened, but she forced a smile. "I'm sure it is," she replied, her voice smooth and measured. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt a wave of discomfort at the ease with which Adrian spoke to her. He hadn't bowed. He hadn't acknowledged her royal lineage with the usual formality. Was this arrogance or something else? The silence between them stretched, thick and almost suffocating. Solara could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. She was the princess of Zerathia, after all. She could handle this. She had to. As she walked closer to him, every step felt heavier. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something she couldn't quite place. Adrian's eyes followed her movements, but there was no judgment in them. No calculation. Just a steady, unwavering gaze. It was as if she wasn't the princess of a mighty empire, but simply another person. And that infuriated her. "You'll be traveling with me," Adrian continued, his tone unchanging. "I'll make sure you're safe. We'll be taking the shuttle to the neutral zone shortly." Solara nodded, her expression tight. She didn't trust humans. But the council had insisted on the meeting, and she had no choice but to comply. Despite her unease, she couldn't afford to show weakness. She had a duty to her people. And yet, as she followed Adrian through the corridors of the ship, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow reading her, seeing through her carefully crafted exterior. The journey to the neutral zone was uneventful, and yet every second of it gnawed at Solara's nerves. Adrian remained stoic, his attention seemingly fixed on the datapad in his hands. She watched him in silence, studying him. He was focused, efficient, and strangely calm. But it wasn't just his demeanor that made her uneasy. It was the unsettling thought that he was different from all the humans she had been taught to fear and despise. She didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. When they finally reached the neutral zone, Solara found herself in an unfamiliar environment. The station was nothing like the towering, pristine cities of Zerathia. The place was a blend of human and alien technology, functional and efficient, but without the grandeur of her own people's designs. As they disembarked, she found herself thinking once again of Adrian. His presence, so calm, so assured, felt like an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. The delegation from the Galactic Council was already gathered, their attention focused on the arrival of the delegates. Pull she felt toward him. She had never trusted humans. Never. But Adrian was different. She could sense it now, more than ever. He wasn't just an ordinary soldier. He was someone who had lived through countless battles, someone who had seen things she couldn't even begin to comprehend. He wasn't afraid of her, and in some strange way, that made her want to trust him. As they navigated the ship's corridors, chaos erupted around them. The air was thick with tension, and the sounds of distant explosions rattled the walls. It felt like the world was coming apart at the seams. Solara's hand instinctively reached for the hilt of her sword, but Adrian stopped her. "Don't," he warned in a low voice. "It's not our fight right now." Solara bristled, but the urgency in his voice made her pause. She wasn't used to following orders, but something about Adrian made it hard to resist. He had an air of authority, of experience, that made her want to trust his judgment. The ship's corridors were a maze of flashing lights and alarms as they ran, and yet Adrian seemed to know exactly where he was going. Solara found herself relying on him more with each passing second, her earlier reservations fading into the background as she focused on survival. They reached the shuttle bay, but just as they were about to board, a massive explosion rocked the ship. The shockwave sent both of them sprawling to the ground, and Solara let out a sharp gasp as her head hit the metal floor. Everything around her spun, the world blurring at the edges. She barely had time to regain her bearings before Adrian was lifting her to her feet, his strong hands steadying her as the sounds of battle raged outside. "Stay close," he urged again, his grip firm on her arm as they rushed toward the shuttle. The tension was palpable, and Solara could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The shuttle was their only chance now. It was their escape from the chaos, from the unknown enemy that had attacked them. But as they ran toward the hatch, Solara couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. Would they even make it out alive? They reached the shuttle just as another explosion rocked the ship, shaking the entire structure. Adrian threw open the hatch, urging her inside. As soon as she was safely aboard, he followed, sealing the door behind him. Solara collapsed into one of the seats, her heart still racing. She was alive. They were alive. But the uncertainty of what lay ahead hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't escape the feeling that everything she had known had just been ripped away. As the shuttle ascended from the ship, the distance between them and the chaos grew. Solara allowed herself a moment to breathe, to take in the gravity of the situation. She was no longer just a princess. She was a survivor. And in that survival, she had been forced into an unexpected alliance with a human soldier. Adrian, meanwhile, seemed unfazed by the chaos that had just unfolded. He sat across from her, his expression unreadable, but Solara could see the faintest hint of concern in his eyes. For the first time, she realized that beneath the tough exterior, there was something more. Something human. "Thank you," Solara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was because she had never been so thankful for another person's presence in her life. Adrian nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. "Don't mention it. You'd have done the same for me." Solara stared at him, taken aback by his words. She had expected him to dismiss her, to treat her like an inferior. But instead, he spoke with a kind of equality she hadn't experienced before. It unsettled her, and for the first time, she realized that humans were not the mindless creatures she had been taught to fear. They were more complex, more capable than she had ever imagined. The shuttle soared through the stars, and as the chaos of the battle faded behind them, Solara found herself caught between two conflicting emotions. The princess within her still wanted to view humans as beneath her, but the soldier in Adrian, and the vulnerability they had shared in the face of danger, had left an undeniable mark on her. An alliance had been forged in the heat of battle, one forced by fate, And as the stars passed by outside, Solara couldn't help but wonder just where this unexpected partnership would lead them next. The shuttle surged through the void of space, its engines humming with the steady rhythm of its flight. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the unspoken fear that hung between Princess Scalara and Captain Adrian Hayes almost palpable. The chaos they had left behind on the warship seemed to echo in their minds, a haunting reminder of the violence and destruction that had torn apart the peaceful moment they had shared earlier. Yet even in the midst of their shared uncertainty, a strange bond had begun to form between them, something neither had expected. Adrian sat across from Solara, his eyes scanning the instruments and displays before him. His jaw was set in determination, every line of his face hardened by years of service. But his eyes, they softened whenever they met hers. For just a brief moment, he allowed himself to glance at her. Solara's royal appearance had seemed so imposing at first, a dignified figure of strength and grace. But now, in the quiet of the shuttle, her vulnerability was undeniable. She wasn't just a princess. She was a person, struggling to adapt to a world she never imagined herself being a part of. Adrian couldn't help but think about how unexpected everything had been. From the moment he first saw Solara, his mission had seemed simple: escort the alien princess to the summit and ensure her safety. He had never imagined that a raid, an attack on their very vessel, would disrupt everything. He had also never expected to find himself in a fight for his life alongside someone who, just hours ago, had been a symbol of the very empire that had considered humans inferior. He tried not to think about the distance between them. It was hard enough to focus on their immediate survival. As the shuttle cruised through space, the reality of their situation settled in. They weren't just facing the chaos of the battle. They were facing an uncertain future. They had escaped the battle, yes, but the question was where to go next. Where could they seek refuge from the unknown enemy that had attacked them? Solara's mind was in a similar turmoil. She had never thought she would find herself in a human's debt. She had been raised to believe that humans were weak, primitive creatures, beneath her station and her understanding. But Adrian had shown her another side of humanity, one she hadn't expected. He had been calm in the face of danger, not just protective but willing to risk his life for hers. She couldn't deny that a part of her admired him. He was nothing like the men she had encountered in her royal court, men who sought power for their own selfish desires. Adrian had a strength that came from experience, from a life lived on the edge, and that strength made her question everything she had been taught to believe. But despite the shift in her feelings, Solara couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. They were still being pursued. She didn't need to be a military strategist to understand that the enemy who attacked the warship would stop at nothing to find them. Their escape had been barely successful, and it was only a matter of time before they would be hunted down. She needed to think, to come up with a plan, but the weight of her situation made it hard to focus. Her usual confidence had begun to falter. "You're thinking too hard," Adrian said, his voice breaking the silence. Solara looked at him sharply, startled by his words. "What do you mean?" He met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "You're looking at the stars like they hold all the answers. But right now, the answer is simple. We fight. We survive." Solara couldn't argue with that. The idea of running had crossed her mind, but it didn't make sense. The enemy would catch them sooner or later. And there was something about Adrian's resolve, his unshakable determination, that made her trust his words. She had to survive. They both had to survive. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Adrian stood up and moved toward the front of the shuttle. "We're going to need weapons, and we're going to need somewhere to hide. I'm not sure where exactly the attack came from, but I have a few places in mind. We won't be able to outrun them forever. The best thing we can do now is to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Solara's heart raced. The thought of being hunted by a relentless enemy was terrifying, but Adrian's confidence was contagious. She rose to her feet, her movements graceful despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Lead the way." Adrian nodded and pressed a few buttons on the shuttle's console. The ship's course shifted, and Solara could feel the subtle change in the acceleration. They were heading for a location Adrian had clearly mapped out in his mind, a place that might give them a chance at survival. As the shuttle maneuvered through space, Solara couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to trust him fully, to place her fate in his hands. She was not used to relying on others, but for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her vulnerability and the strength of their partnership. Adrian had already begun securing the shuttle's interior, checking the compartments for any supplies they might need. Solara watched him, her mind working to process everything that had happened. She had never fought for survival like this. She had never been in a position where her life depended on someone else's skills. And yet, as she looked at Adrian, she realized she was beginning to trust him more than she had trusted anyone in her entire life. "Do you have any idea who attacked us?" she asked, her voice low. Adrian glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "Not sure. But whoever they are, they're organized. It's not a random attack. They've been planning this." Solara nodded, her eyes narrowing as the reality of their situation sank in. They were fighting against an unknown enemy, one that had the resources and skill to strike without warning. It was a war they hadn't expected to be a part of, but now, there was no turning back. As the shuttle continued its course, Solara and Adrian prepared for whatever was to come. Weapons were retrieved from storage, and each movement felt calculated, precise. They weren't just passengers in this fight. They were active participants. The princess and the soldier. Together, they were beginning to form a bond that transcended rank, a partnership born out of necessity and survival. The shuttle reached its destination, a hidden outpost in a remote part of the galaxy. It was quiet, isolated, and for the moment, it was the only place that offered them any hope of safety. But even as they touched down, the sense of impending danger hung over them. They weren't alone, and the enemy wasn't far behind. "Stay alert," Adrian said as they moved toward the outpost's entrance. His voice was low, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of a seasoned warrior. Solara stayed close behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. The outpost was eerily silent as they stepped inside. The walls were bare, but there was an air of resilience in the place, as if it had weathered countless storms. Solara had no idea how long they could stay there, but for now, it was their best chance. The first step in their fight for survival had begun. Solara had been forced into an alliance with Adrian, a human soldier, and together, they would face whatever came next. In the quiet of the outpost, as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, Solara couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they survived this fight. Would things ever be the same between her and Adrian? Would she ever look at humans the same way again? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The fight for survival had only just begun. The night was dark, the stars outside the shuttle barely visible through the haze of distant cosmic dust. The outpost where they had taken refuge was silent, the only sound the hum of the shuttle's engines idling in the background. Inside, the tension was thick, each breath laden with the heavy weight of what was about to come. Adrian, however, was a different kind of warrior. He was fast, moving between cover with the ease of someone who had fought in countless skirmishes. His shots were calculated, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. He knew how to disable their shields, how to hit them where it would hurt. The battle raged on, a cacophony of blaster fire and the sound of feet pounding across the metal floor. Solara's heart pounded in her chest, her every movement a fight against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had never been in the heat of battle like this, but with Adrian beside her, she felt a glimmer of hope. His presence was a constant, his movements steady and sure, guiding her, protecting her. The tide of battle seemed to shift back and forth, the two of them against an entire squad of enemy soldiers. But just when it seemed like they might be overwhelmed, Adrian gave Solara a nod, signaling it was time to move. He fired one last shot, hitting the lead soldier square in the chest. The alien's shield shattered, and with a final scream, he crumpled to the floor. "Move," Adrian shouted, and Solara didn't hesitate. She ran behind him, both of them making a dash for the exit. The outpost wasn't large, but it was filled with narrow hallways and rooms that were perfect for ambushes. The walls were lined with high-tech equipment, the remnants of an earlier civilization, and it seemed that even the very structure of the place was a weapon waiting to be used against them. As they sprinted through the outpost, the enemy was on their heels, their pursuit unrelenting. But just as they reached the final doorway leading out to the outer courtyard, a massive explosion rocked the building, throwing them both to the ground. Adrian's ears rang, and for a moment, everything was a blur. When he came to, he saw Solara lying a few feet away, her body crumpled against the floor. Panic surged in him as he crawled toward her, his hands reaching out to check for signs of life. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her face pale, but she was alive. "Solara," he breathed, relief flooding through him. "Are you okay?" She groaned, pushing herself up with a dazed look in her eyes. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice was weak. Just a little stunned." Adrian helped her to her feet, his grip firm around her arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." They weren't safe yet. The enemy was close, and the outpost was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, a trap. But Adrian wasn't about to let that stop them. He knew what had to be done. The fight for survival was far from over. And with Solara by his side, they were going to make it out of there, no matter the cost. As they sprinted toward the shuttle, the sound of enemy footsteps closing in behind them, they knew that this wasn't just a battle for their lives. It was a battle for everything they stood for. The clash of titans was just beginning. The shuttle roared to life, its engines firing up with a thundering force as the last of the enemy soldiers were left behind in the ruins of the outpost. Adrian's fingers flew across the control panel, expertly navigating the ship away from the decimated structure. Solara sat beside him, her face pale, but her eyes burning with determination. She was no longer just a princess caught in a foreign war. She was a warrior in her own right, surviving and fighting alongside Adrian. The battlefield had transformed her, as it had done for him. As the shuttle ascended through the atmosphere, the battle below them became a blur of lights and explosions. The enemies they had fought were relentless, but in the end, it was the two of them who had come out victorious. There were no cheers, no moments of celebration. This was a world where victory was simply a brief respite before the next wave of danger arrived. But there was something deeper in Adrian's heart, something that wasn't just about survival. He glanced at Solara and saw the resolve in her eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. This fight had changed them both. The stars outside the shuttle grew larger as they moved into deep space, away from the war zone. Solara leaned back in her seat, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. The throbbing in her head had started to fade, but there was an ache that lingered in her chest, an ache that had nothing to do with physical injury. She was alive, yes, but the war was far from over. And in a way, it felt like her life was just beginning, though it was nothing like what she had imagined when she first left her planet as a young princess. Adrian broke the silence, his voice calm and steady. "We need to find a place to lay low. If they're still after us, we can't afford to be too visible." Solara nodded, her mind already spinning with the implications. "Where do we go? I'm not sure where we can hide anymore. Everywhere we go, it seems like the enemy is waiting for us." He thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered their options. There's an uncharted planet about 2 light years away. It's a hostile environment, barely suitable for survival, but it might be the perfect place to disappear for a while. Solara frowned, uncertainty creeping into her thoughts. Hostile. What kind of place is it? Adrian smiled wryly. Desolate. Harsh. dangerous, but we're not exactly in a position to be picky. We need somewhere off the grid, where no one will think to look for us." Solara took a deep breath, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. "Then that's where we're going." The shuttle's engines hummed steadily as they charted a course to the unknown planet. Solara gazed out of the viewport, her mind racing. She had never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn. Just days ago, she had been in the midst of courtly politics, concerned with matters of diplomacy and royalty. Now she was a fugitive, on the run from an enemy she had never expected to encounter. But none of that mattered now. She was here, with Adrian, and that was enough. Whatever happened next, she knew that they would face it together. The journey to the desolate planet was long, and silence settled over them. There were no distractions, no comforting sounds, just the hum of the shuttle's engines as they cut through the cold void of space. Solara closed her eyes, her mind wandering back to the day she had first met Adrian. It had been a strange encounter, filled with tension and uncertainty, but in that moment, she had known something deep within her heart, that he was different, that he would protect her, not because of her status or her title, but because he understood what it meant to fight for survival. He was her ally, her equal, and perhaps in some ways more than that. Adrian glanced over at her, sensing the storm of thoughts behind her calm facade. "We'll make it through this," he said quietly, his voice soft but full of conviction. "You've got what it takes, Solara. I've seen it in you." She turned her gaze to him, meeting his eyes. "I didn't know what I was capable of until I had no choice but to fight. But I've seen the way you fight, Adrian. You've taught me more than you know." The shuttle's warning system beeped suddenly, pulling them both out of their thoughts. The planet was approaching. The vast, barren landscape came into view, stretching endlessly beneath a darkened sky. The planet was covered in jagged cliffs, deep canyons, and harsh winds that kicked up dust storms. There were no signs of life, no signs of civilization, just endless terrain that seemed to stretch on forever. It was perfect for what they needed. "Looks like it's just us and the elements," Adrian said, his voice filled with a touch of humor as he guided the shuttle toward the surface. Solara didn't laugh. She couldn't. The sight of the desolate landscape hit her hard, a reminder that the world she once knew was gone. This was a new reality, one where survival was everything. She had no choice but to adapt, to become someone she never thought she would be. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, the engines powering down as they landed on the barren ground. Outside, the winds howled, carrying with them the scent of dust and decay. It was a harsh, inhospitable world, one that offered no comfort, no promise of safety. But Solara knew they had no other choice. This was their only chance. Adrian was the first to exit the shuttle, his boots crunching against the dry ground as he surveyed the area. "We need to set up camp," he said, glancing over his shoulder at Solara. "We'll have to make do with what we've got. It won't be easy, but we can make it work." Solara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. She followed him out into the unforgiving landscape, her boots leaving marks in the dust. The world around them was silent, except for the howling winds that threatened to swallow everything in their path. It felt like they were the last two people alive on the planet, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. But even in this desolation, Solara found a strange sense of peace. The chaos of the galaxy, the wars, the betrayals, they seemed so far away now. Here, on this barren planet, there was only the present. There was only Adrian, and there was only her. And together, they would survive. They spent the next few days setting up a makeshift camp, using the materials from the shuttle to create shelter from the winds. The harsh environment was a constant reminder of the danger they were in, but it also gave them a sense of purpose. They were no longer just running from the past. They were building a future. Every task, every action, brought them closer together. As they sat around the small fire they had managed to start, Adrian glanced over at Solara, his expression thoughtful. "You know, we may not have much," he said, his voice quiet. "But we have each other, and that's enough." Solara met his gaze, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It was gratitude, but also something more, a bond forged through shared struggle, through survival. In that moment, she realized that this new life they were building was the beginning of something greater. They had faced impossible odds and come out victorious. They had fought against enemies who seemed invincible, only to emerge stronger. The past was behind them, but the future was full of possibilities. A new beginning, not just for Solara or Adrian, but for both of them. The harsh winds howled outside their shelter, but inside they were safe, for now. And that was all they needed. Together, they would face whatever came next, one day at a time. Because in this desolate world, the greatest weapon they had wasn't their technology or their strength. It was the bond between them. And as the fire flickered, casting shadows on their faces, they both knew that the hardest battles were over. The rest, they would face together.